Hello, everybody. How are you? My name is John Miller from BioT Medical. I want to welcome you to a webinar that's looking to tackle an interesting topic in and around the change associated with cloud, but also the opportunities it presents to medical device companies. The flow of our agenda today is really to try to put some perspective to the discussion as it relates to the changes that are being defined in the emerging guidance for an AAMI Cloud Change Control TR115, and also put that in perspective for you in terms of the impact it has to individuals within medical device companies, but also take into perspective the changing life cycle associated with a medical device. So we hope to use this call to introduce what's happening in that domain, what's happening with the guidance, and give you some perspective and some things to think about. What's even most exciting for me is we're bringing a panel of speakers to the table that actually bring a very unique perspective from both their background and role within current companies. But all of these individuals are directly involved with crafting the guidance, so they can give a perspective that has the outcome in mind and their point of view as a baseline. So at this point, I'll just have each of them introduce themselves quite quickly. We'll go through some rules or how we're going to run the webinar, and then we'll get right into the discussion. So Ian, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks, John. So yeah, my name's Ian Sutcliffe. I'm a principal solution architect within the healthcare and life science industry vertical within AWS. So I focus primarily on a lot of compliance topics, medical device topics, pharmaceutical. About 5 years in AWS now. History prior to that was both in medical device and pharma industry. So happy to bring both worlds together as part of this discussion.
Great. Guy?
Hi, I'm a software architect, part of the AAMI working group for Tier 115 and the CTO and co-founder of BioT. We provide a cloud platform for building medical devices that serve remote users, safety and efficacy, dashboards, remote configuration, alert management, video consultations, all that stuff. Good for clinical studies, trials, full-scale commercialization, deployed on AWS. So we take you the perspective of like eating your own dog food approach. On one hand, we are looking for the cloud to have some change controls. And on the other hand, our customers are looking for us to get some change controls from us.
And then Randy?
Hi, so I'm Randy Horton, Chief Solutions Officer at Orthogonal. I was just looking for a good meeting to attend, and somebody sent me this link, so I clicked on it. So Orthogonal is a software developer for regulated medical device software. As I like to say, we develop all the software that's regulated as part of a device, unless it's physically inside a medical device. So it's all the connected components: cloud, mobile, AI integration, EHR integration, backends, those kinds of things. And a couple of years ago, I got pulled into this guidance effort by Pat Baird from Philips, who's a fairly well-known person in our industry who puts a lot of time into moving guidance and standards efforts forward. Thanks for having me.
So just a couple of sort of ground rules relative to the session. We want this to be interactive, but we had over close to 200 RSVPs. So using the chat will be a little difficult to manage. We would ask, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. What I'll be doing and some others is we'll be fielding those, sort of queuing them up, and we'll interject them during the course of the discussion. So please do generate those. If we don't answer them in the webinar, we'll definitely follow up with a response from one or all of the panelists. The other thing, in the attempt to sort of drive sort of engagement, we've got a couple polling questions and just open-ended questions that'll help, one, give perspective of who's on the call, but also help us think about things we can address during the discussion. Also, things that we might need to follow up on. We're trying to create a bit of a community around a key topic that's affecting us all in a positive way, but do it so that we can give both thought leadership, which is the focus of this one, perhaps, but also perhaps some practical ways of doing things in the organization. So with that being said, let me just introduce a quick poll in order to get us started on this. Bear with me one second. So what you'll see is you'll see a poll that really has 3 questions, and what we're just trying to do is get an idea of the audience. First one is just, are you using cloud functions today in your medical device? The other question is just where is your device used? Because we're finding potentially that introduces different paradigms. And then lastly, just where are you at your stage of your device? If you have multiple devices, use the one that's of most top of mind right now. But it'll help kind of, as the speakers go through and address things, keep a perspective. So I'll leave that open just for a little while longer here because there's a number of questions. When you see the response, you'll be able to scroll up and down just a little bit to be able to give you a perspective. So I'll leave this for just a few more seconds here, and then we'll kind of post the results. Okay. A few more coming in, and then we'll go from there. All right, I think that will give us a good perspective of who's on the call. So what you'll see on your Zoom screen is just a pop-up relative to the speakers, relative to the participants in the audience perspective. It looks like there's actually a good percentage of people that are both either in production or in development. So I think the idea of sort of the current challenges they're facing is interesting. The other part is we've got a good cross spectrum of device use, in-use locations. And it does also look like there's sort of a nice balance between people who are already in post-market with their device and in development. So a good perspective across the board, which will lead to the discussion. Okay, so I guess with that, let's jump into the content. I think the first things first is really a discussion on what is TR115, who is AAMI, because there might be some that may need a little background. And Randy, do you want to field that with the group?
Yeah, sure. So a couple of years ago, actually on the eve of the pandemic, we were part of a conversation at a conference with Pat Baird and somebody from one of the hyperscalers about what's the appropriate way to use the public cloud to support functions of the medical device. So not things around the medical device, but actually the operation of the medical device itself. And apparently this is a topic that the FDA had expressed to Pat some interest in because there was a lot of adoption going on. But the sense was that there were some things that were different or had some different nuances with cloud that needed to be addressed. That led to the creation of this was all new to me, a consensus report, which is a way to get basically a group of people together to do a quick hit set of guidance around a timely topic. So this was convened under the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, AAMI, which is it's a standards body, among other. They do many things. But one of is they are sort of the standards body for medical device standards in the United States. They're ANSI-accredited, and so they'll do consensus reports and technical information reports and guidance. So that came out a couple of years ago. And that's an officially blessed AAMI document. So when we talk to you about things in the consensus report, we're speaking on behalf of AAMI. This is canon, you could say. And what we really addressed there was this question of what's different about the cloud for medical devices. And there's issues of cybersecurity and privacy, but those aren't unique to medical devices. Those are true everywhere you have healthcare data. The thing that's really unique on medical devices is how serious and structured we are about change control and about provenance of software and testing it. You don't just slam a change into production in a medical device. As we say, if you move fast and break things with a medical device, you're breaking a human being. And if there's always the risk that if somebody moves fast and breaks things with a connected device, that somebody someday could break human beings at scale, which is a really lousy prospect. But there is a lot of value in cloud because the likelihood of Amazon or Microsoft or Google or another major cloud company losing power or losing internet or running out of spare AC parts or getting hacked are all just so much lower because they're operating at these unbelievable economies of scale that nobody else can work at. So on the whole, in many ways, your device is probably more stable and safer in a cloud than elsewhere. But the reason it's so safe and stable is because these companies make hundreds or thousands of changes a day to their platform. So there's an interesting conundrum. I want to be on, the cloud, somebody else's computer that I indirectly control, they directly control, because it's really stable. But the reason it's really stable is because they're changing it nonstop. So how do I reconcile that with our obligation in medical device to not change things until we're sure the change works? And that sort of was the evolution of this. And what came out of the consensus report, which was published in 2021, was basically let's all say out loud, we do not have direct control, and that's okay. Hi, I'm Randy. I do not have direct control of the servers that my medical device is running on. And that's fine, because there's precedence for this in medical device, but we need to acknowledge it out loud and say, well, how do we deal with that? And this is going to be a really crazy concept for us. Let's take a risk-based approach to assessing the risks and how we design our devices. It's the same thing we do with everything in medical devices. Let's take a risk-based approach. The difference is if you have a quality management system and you have a supplier who's bringing you screws for your medical device, when that truck backs up to the factory with the screws, you can halt that truck, grab a bunch of screws off of it, sample, test them, try and break them, make sure they're the right size. You have a window before you allow that truck, that shipment into your factory and into your supply chain where you can do quality control. You still have a stop. Now, it may mess up your supply chain. It may mess up your targets for manufacturing, but you can hold it off and make sure. With the cloud, it's instant. The second that something's changed by the cloud provider, it's in your medical device. It's sort of in the patient instantly. So how do you manage for that? So that led to the creation of this technical information report. You can think of a consensus report as a baby standard, and a TIR is sort of a baby guidance. TIR is sort of a teenager. It's not a standard, so it doesn't say what you have to do, but it's sort of a culmination of best practices. And really what we looked at here was this idea of, well, the way we're gonna assure that our devices are stable even when they're being changed is by taking a very proactive stance to monitoring them, designing our devices and designing the risk in the first place so that they're well designed. You don't put a function in the cloud that you can't afford downtime for. If the pacemaker is going to turn off if it loses connection in the cloud, don't put that function in the cloud. And it was really how do we design for that? And we can get into some of the answers of that. So what you're going to hear now talking about the TIR, this is sort of the collective thinking of the group as it's coming together, but we're sort of speaking generally about where things are going. This is not a guarantee of where it's going, nor does it necessarily speak for all the members of our working group, although it's a fantastic working group. So let me pause with that. John, did I cover it? Sorry, that was a little long.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I mean, the end of the day, it's the working group has as med tech enterprises, uniquely the players like ourselves and Orthogonal and good involvement from standards bodies and the public cloud providers, everybody who has to cooperate for the solution. So the good thing is this isn't something being done on an island. It actually has a really good participation that's there. So it'll probably, it will more than likely be something that can be adopted, but also implemented, right? Yeah. So why don't we kick off some things? I think one of the things is in medical device, one of the things that gets in the way of change is, especially if you're, some of the people on the call may not be software quality individuals, or some of them may not be cloud individuals. What's the purpose for all of the validation, verification, and design control activities, and how does that play into this issue of change control in cloud? Ian, you want to take a shot or initial perspective? You bring kind of both industry and technology to it.
Yes, it's kind of interesting, sitting outside the industry per se right now. So yeah, I mean, verification, validation, I always boil that ocean down to it's very formalized, structured testing to demonstrate that change has not negatively impacted anything, be that quality. I work across pharma and med device. So has that change negatively impacted product quality or device quality that could in some way endanger patient safety? Ultimately, at the end of the day, everything we do is focused on ensuring patient safety. So these are just the formal ways of performing those verification activities in a way where you can actually demonstrate it. So this is what's kind of unique about the med device and in this industry. It's not just doing your job well, but proving that you're doing it well. So it's a lot of the evidence. So this consistent need for inspection readiness, or evidence that you are maintaining that quality level, is a little unique in this industry.
Yeah. Anyone else want to add any comments to that?
Let me give an example. For example, if your software predicts a heart attack, regardless if it's running on the cloud or on the device, this safety and efficacy translates to verifying that your predictions rarely produce false positives or false negatives.
Yeah.
The metaphor I'll give that's a little more layman than these is sometimes people who are in the software industry and don't know medical device say, okay, I mean, I get it. So it's safety, you got to test well, but why do you need so much of this extra overhead on it? I was like, okay, so think about your team, your software team, and the last build they did of software. Was it good? Yeah, it was good quality. You put it in production? Yeah. Okay, give it to me. I'm going to put that code in your mom's pacemaker right now. They're like, well, no. Why? Well, I might want to test it some more. I'm like, and there you have it. That's why.
It's sprint without documentation and full V&V is just basically a sprint. I mean, the idea there's a discipline there for a good reason. And it's been in place for medical devices for a long time. We know that because there are currently functions and systems built around devices. So what's different about cloud? How does that start to change the approach, the game, the rules? What's your thoughts on that? Randy, you want to go take a shot first?
Yeah, I think what's different about the cloud is there's this trade-off you're weighing of my goal is a stable system that's reliable and is always there that we define we need. And the cloud is really good at that. It's really hard for anybody who's been in any corporate data center or relied on a corporate data center knows things go down, right? Servers are down or there's a bad backup or whatever. We've all had nightmares and don't want those things to happen on our medical devices. Even if the device is still properly functioning, if it's inconveniencing the users, it still makes people nervous, very much so. Or sometimes people start to doubt the whole device because there's something weird going on in one part of it, even if it's not technically making the device unsafe. So how do you do that and how do you manage that is really around, like we said, admitting that's a situation and then just managing to it. You design for it and you then get really proactive at monitoring it. I think that's the step up. That's the new element here is we've always had some element of monitoring in our industry, but to some extent, monitoring could have included, I'm going to wait for customer calls to come in, patient calls to come in that there might be a problem. This is saying you got to do more than that. You really need to do more than that. The good news is the tools really lend themselves to it because we're not the only industry that's worrying about this. Everybody using the cloud is thinking about this. And the cloud actually essentially comes with some really great tools for doing that.
Good. Guy, any perspective from you to share?
Yeah, change control, in my eyes as a software developer, goes beyond high availability, meaning how to mitigate cloud failures. When Amazon CTO Werner Vogel says everything fails all the time, it usually means those outages of physical components like servers, networks, etc. When I think about change control, I also think about controlling software changes. That's a different problem than planning for outages. There are different complexities there.
Yeah, I think, Ian, maybe that if you could add to the perspective, one of the questions that came here from the group is the idea is there's new technology that you're introducing, but then there's also new features. There's the idea that you're constantly improving your devices. So you maybe want to answer the question of what's different in cloud with a V&V perspective, but how does that potentially address a little bit of more of the life cycle?
Yeah, I think there's some things that are no different from cloud. So maybe I'll start there. So I mean, there's challenges you have whenever you have a distributed system. So a connected device, that there's times when things will fail. So as Guy mentioned, physical devices, hardware will fail, but that was the same if you were on premise or in cloud. So your architecture, your device design needs to cater for that. If it cannot sustain, work properly after a loss of connection, then there's a design fault. It's nothing to do really with cloud. Then the robustness of cloud. So Randy mentioned that. So understanding that cloud services, if you store something in the cloud, it's not just stored in one location. The services typically will replicate that across 3 availability zones at a minimum. So it's like 3 data centers. Now there are med device companies out there that don't even have 3 data centers. So you can start to see the benefits of the architecture of the services. It's built for that resilience. Again, back to Guy's point, things will fail, but services are architected to be resilient in these cases. And then the final thing I'd say is like you've got to understand that, yes, your cloud service provider is making changes. It's making changes all the time, but you have to understand how they make changes. So regulations, really, they're looking for companies to follow industry best practices. They're not looking for anything more. They're not imposing additional constraints on software engineering teams. They're looking for best practices. So visibility into your cloud service provider and how they deal with change. So, this idea of lots of small changes is lower risk than one big change, because immediately if things have been impacted. Then consider the rollout of that change. I've worked in med device companies. They have dev, test, validated environment, and a production, and that's pretty much their pipeline. When you look at cloud service providers, they have dev, test, alpha, beta, gamma, multiple. Then they will roll it out to a single machine in a single data center, then a small fleet, and then the whole data. So the rollout is incremental, and to Randy's point, that monitoring is happening all the time. If there is the slightest indication of any kind of regression, that is rolled back. So you need to understand and kind of go work through some of these misconceptions that cloud is a higher risk. I think Randy mentioned it earlier. I mean, these hyperscalers invest so much in security, for example, way more than any one company could normally invest. So you just have to work through all of these points. And that's kind of my role, I guess, on the team for this TIR. It's like cutting through what we call the FUD and getting to the core and actual, the facts and the data to support a position.
And I think one thing I'll add, what you were saying, and I'll use the metaphor of autonomous cars. There's a lot of fear of our autonomous cars safe. And there've been some pretty high profile, horrific accidents where people looked and said, well, a human driving never would have done that. Okay, so that's true. So there's a new kind of accident, essentially, that's been introduced by an autonomous car, new root cause. However, if you look at number of accidents per million miles driven and number of injuries per million miles driven, I think in general, what we're seeing is autonomous cars tend to be a lot safer. So are you willing to trade off? We're going to reduce the total number of injuries, but introduce a couple kind of new injuries in the process. Are we prepared to sort of have a cold economic view of this? And I think that's similar with the cloud. Certain risks are larger than other places. Overall, fundamentally, I think you're better as long as you understand those risks and work to manage them.
Well, and I think, Guy, maybe you have a perspective, because obviously we help run cloud-powered medical devices for companies. So the idea is, while there might be all these underlying changes, and we have to accept that, we have to adopt for it and address it. Do you have any perspective there?
Yeah, so that starts with understanding that, as Randy mentioned earlier, if there is a change, it's immediately in the patient, and the next best thing you can do as the medical device cloud is to detect it immediately with the patient, not a lot long after the patient. And in practice, that means doing automated periodic regression tests on your production environment, where if one of your tests fails, that may hint that maybe a change in the cloud broke something in your medical device.
Let me jump in with a caveat. I personally strongly agree with what Guy said. That is not the full consensus of our entire committee. It's a point of really interesting and valuable discussion right now. Everybody agrees we need to be proactive. Where you draw that line in terms of like, do I need to retest everything every 6 seconds automated or not? That's going to be, it'll end up being a risk-based approach. And what we recommend is still information.
For sure. Everything here is about the risk. What I was mentioning is, for the real sensitive activity that you do.
Yeah. And
Now,
by the way,
I was going to weigh in for, again, I mentioned, the regulations are not asking anything more of us than, industry best practices. So, automating your change and release pipelines, CI/CD pipelines, having testing, automated testing in those pipelines, that's common. Everybody does that. If there are times when you are not releasing a new version of your device, this is when you maybe want to start to consider periodic regression testing. And then you look into production. So all the top performing engineering teams are doing some form of testing in production. That just to tease out those edge cases that you will only detect in a productive environment, be that feature release, A/B testing, canary testing, whatever it is, there's different forms of testing. And this is just, software engineering best practices. But to Randy's point, I worked in medtech. The only time they actually responded was when there was reports from the field that something was going wrong with a device. And so you would get recalls. But that was old school on premise. Now with this kind of underlying change that's happening by your cloud provider, these techniques of regression testing, production testing should now be part of your arsenal for monitoring.
And by the way, if you look at the new FDA cybersecurity guidance, this is a theme we're seeing in general. You can no longer put your device out, test it to make sure it's secure, and then say, well, therefore it's indefinitely secure. The threat environment changes over time. So therefore you need to continue to reassure yourself or reconvince yourself. I don't know what the exact regulatory term is, but you got to be certain that it continues to be safe. Just because it was safe yesterday doesn't mean it's necessarily secure today. And it's a similar concept. It's a wild, crazy world out there. That's awesome. We can get a ton of benefit from it, but you got to be careful. Well, one last point, I'm sorry, Swallow, building on something Ian said, when you say you have a problem in production, in some ways, the best case scenario when you have a problem with production is the system goes down, because then there's a problem. What's really scary when you oversee systems is when you discover there's a problem and the system appears to be working as it is. And then you have to say, wow, what's actually happening versus what do we think is happening? How long has this been going on for? How much damage has been done, or bad things have happened, or miscalculated interest rates are there that we now have to go back and clean up? And I can tell you from a systems point of view, it's stressful when the system goes down. It's a lot more stressful when you have this moment you're like, oh, wow, it's not working how it's supposed to. And how long has this been going on? Is that my code?
Let me give you an incident from our history at BioT, where there was a cloud update that caused a stream of biomarkers to get stored incorrectly. All the decimal numbers that happened to be integers were just dropped from the stream, and that caused subsequent data calculations to produce wrong results, and took us some good days to realize this was happening, and a few additional days to release a fix for that.
Yeah. So I think let's transition, because I'm going to pose an arching question, because in some regards it'll help add color to the next two questions. So I'm going to launch and basically it's just looking for what are the biggest obstacles or challenges you face as an organization. Realistically, it's not a poll because we couldn't figure out all the categories so just give us some perspective and it'll fuel the discussion. because what we want to do is transition a little bit into the life cycle of a device, because you've got, hey, we're designing and developing the device and the cloud functions, and then we're in market, and we'll tackle those sort of in incremental discussions. So I'll leave the poll up here just for a little bit more time, and I'll use that to sort of fuel a question from the group. So any perspectives are good. I'll leave it up there just for another 15 seconds. But as you guys, as the audience can already tell, the dialogue in and amongst the working group is both dynamic, you know, with perspective. And on top of that, everyone's trying to get to how do we best embrace all the positive that comes from cloud, knowing full well that we need safe and effective medical device technologies that we're deploying.
I have to say, in a career of doing lots of facilitation of workshops and meetings, this is by far the most mentally exhausting facilitation I've ever done. Not because people are difficult, people are incredibly supportive and collaborative, but just because the topics have been so abstract and people comes from so many points of view, and there's so much intelligence in the room, and everybody's really leaning in and participating. So, you know, you facilitate something, you think you got locked down, and then guy says, well, wait, what about this angle? It's like, no, stop, don't, it's brilliant, but don't.
Well, I mean, with that, so let's tackle those two kind of broad categories. So first thing is just, so what do we do when we design for the cloud? And when we're in a more of a concept and development phase prior to releasing. So what are your guys' thoughts on that? What are some best practices or considerations that have been discussed amongst the working group? Guy, you want to take a shot at that first?
Yeah, so again, my mind goes always for the testing and taking into account that, of course, this is a risk-based approach. So let's talk about the testing that you really think you should do, because if things fail there, then patients can get hurt. So usually we think of testing as something in the pipeline of the CI/CD, and then there's the production. And of course, there are tools like the Chaos Monkey of Netflix, etc., that also try to challenge systems in production. But I don't think it's you know, even 50% of SaaS companies are using those methods. So I think that is going to change when we are thinking about clouds as part of the medical devices, where tests are going to become part of the product. When you deploy your product, you also deploy those automated tests, and they start working and running and doing more than just the Chaos Monkey, which you know, just shuts down cloud resources. These tests are going to validate data integrity calculations and all of that.
Great. You know, hey, Ian, maybe you could jump in. And one question that came in from the group is like, how do you translate risk management to the things you're doing in cloud?
Yeah, and that's interesting. So it's kind of a, you know, I'm a solution architect, techie at heart. So, you know, I'm always looking at the architecture of these systems, you know, and then trying to also bring in the regulations that may influence or constrain these architectures. So one of the things that I always start with is, you know, when you create your architecture models, you know, there's regulatory requirements to do threat modeling, you know, so you've got to bring in immediately this kind of risk management perspective. But it's also important to understand where the risk is and target your efforts appropriately based on that risk level. So part of that is, you know, breaking down this architecture into its components. So which piece of this architecture is actually a medical device, and therefore subject to the FDA regulations and everything that goes along with it, and which is the environment within it that it operates. And then you have things like MDDS, or medical device data systems, which is focused on the connectivity piece. So you can start to break down the architecture and build these kind of compliance boundaries. So this bit is subject to XYZ. This bit is subject to something differently. And the risk level associated with the device functions is much higher than the risk associated with the environment within which it operates. So you can imagine, you have functions running in a container, which is running on an operating system, on a virtual machine, in the cloud. And so the focus is on those medical functions. Those have a direct kind of correlation to safety. The virtual server it's running on, low risk. I mean, you look at ISPE GAMP guidance, software category 1, considered low risk. And so breaking that architecture into those pieces and applying risk management thoughtfully in that case. So I draw from, this move of the FDA from computer system validation to computer system assurance, applying some critical thinking to the architecture, and then applying risk management thoughtfully to that architecture and appropriately.
Hey, Randy, on that thread, one of the things, Ian brought up is a number of terms of reference, which may only fall into one of the many stakeholders in a medical device who have an interest in the outcome of a medical device. You've got new vocabulary, new terms, new definitions. How do you look at this from an enterprise, and how do you get everybody on the same page during the dev stage?
I suggest you print off the glossary of terms and keep it up next to you as step one. I'm actually not kidding. I still do that old school, tape it up literally. I think the challenging part about this, and what's interesting, we've seen this is not any different than AI and data science or other areas, is when you get into one of these new technology domains where people are unfamiliar, all of a sudden the old silos don't work as well because we haven't kicked the tires on it to figure out, we haven't learned the lessons. So there's this process of us learning. And what that means is it means that everybody has to be in each other's jobs a little bit more and a little more sophisticated. It's not that you have to be able to do every job on the team, but if you're in data science, you need to understand a little bit of the regulatory perspective and the frameworks. And if you're in regulatory, you need to understand a little bit about, cloud architecture. You can't just say, oh, I do regulatory, I don't understand this AI stuff. Those people do it, or I don't understand that concept, they do it. You're going to have get together and really understand this. The goal, actually, I think in many ways, the TIR, or one of the things we hope will come out of it, is it'll create a common language that it's been written in a way so that every key function in a medical device development and support team, an organization will be able to use together to create that common language to say, okay, here's the goal, here's the principle. Now, how does that translate? You can then back up from that and say, well, there's this, not this. The challenge is always like, you get into the situation where you got the wrong answer because you didn't ask exactly the right question because you didn't know to ask the exact right question. I think we're hoping to improve that situation.
And I'll pick up that terminology point because that's a big stumbling block for many customers, because the regulations were written years ago, pre-cloud in many cases, and so the terminology didn't include cloud. There's nothing in the regulations that precludes cloud, but it doesn't explicitly accept cloud, which is the problem. Many companies, unless the FDA says yay on cloud, they won't use it. But then you get into the terminology. So, there's terms in 62304 like SOUP, software of unknown provenance, or OTS, and people try and map that to cloud services, which then if you read in the detail, SOUP and OTS are software units or modules that are incorporated into a medical device. So when customers are trying to manage cloud services as SOUP or OTS, that they're going down the wrong track because it's not incorporated into the device. So that's where the TIR is kind of redefining some of this. So you've got the medical device system and then the medical device data or digital environment within which it operates. And pretty much we went through a lot of use cases. Cloud services fall into the latter. It's part of the environment. It's GAMP category 1 software. It's that kind of thing. So yes, the TIO is trying to redefine some of the terminology, or at least clarify.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll add to that. As Ian mentioned, the standard of 62304 was written some years ago, and definitely the whole concept of API economy developed later, where new software paradigms now use so many different SaaS vendors or PaaS vendors and take that functionality from them. Not only the infrastructure cloud vendor, but other many platforms. I guess many of you here use maybe Twilio for messaging or others. So we're living today in an API economy, and that's why the standard that mentions the SOUP and the OTS must get an update, and that was our challenge: how to bring this API economy to something that you can consider, know how to consider when you build a medical device. And the whole point of risk management, that just last sentence, is that the riskiest code is the code that you write yourself. If you use those APIs that many others use, these are much less risky.
I think the final point on terminology, and it's also bringing back some well-known terminology. If you look at the definition, change by ITIL or whatever. So there's different types of change. So the most or highest risk is potentially a deprecation of a feature or a service. So you need to be notified. You need to change your system to accommodate that. Probably the least risk is new features. So that's additional functionality that you're not using yet. So inherently low risk. Then there's everything else that I think was called standard change in the old days. That's kind of run-of-the-mill, low risk, very frequent changes, and that's the bulk of the changes that you probably see on a day-to-day basis. Where it's bug fixes, minor feature enhancements. But with to Guy's point, the API economy in that situation is you always have backward compatibility. So those changes, although frequent, should not impact the existing functionality of what you're using. So when you think about change, it seems this big scary beast, but breaking it down into those kind of three categories and understanding the impact or the risk that may have on your system, it's important just to bring that back and re-emphasize it.
Yeah, maybe a question just general to any on the team. There was a question that basically said, how do you deal with different degrees of change? And I think you started to allude to this, Ian, in terms of levels of risk. Like there's bug fixes and patches, and then there's major features and enhancements. Is there a classification of how you mobilize around that in the TIR, or is really just using a risk-based approach to determine the degree of process you put around each? Guy, you have any thoughts on that? Just how do you deal with sort of minor issues, basically probably in code, versus major needs in terms of new features and functionality?
Yeah, so it's always a question in software development. What is your coverage? How much? Yeah. How deep you want to test things? And it's not only a matter of time of the software developer that actually develops those tests. When you run those tests on the cloud, the tests cost money. So sometimes you need to limit your tests because they cost too much and break your business model. So there are many considerations here, not all of them around human lives, I would say.
Anyone else have anything else to add there?
I think the one change that's going to have to come, and it's just more of a mindset or approach thing, is we used to think of medical devices as being done. It's finished, it's launched, it's approved, it's reimbursed. Relax. We can start to think about the next version. And I think in the software world, things are never done. And it's not to say that we will be changing core functions of a medical device 60 times a day, like a social media, site will. But we're a hamster on a treadmill now, or not treadmill, a wheel, right? We're a hamster on a wheel now. And I think we need to get used to that and expect these things are going to happen, rather than being shocked that, oh, there's a problem, we got to scramble to take care of it. We should just get really good at managing change and rolling with it, as opposed to, it being a revelation. Oh, something happened. Let's get used to it. And let's just get really good at it.
Go ahead.
There's a classic metric in sort of systems engineering, mean time between failure, right? Or you see it at a construction site, 30 days since the last accident, right? And the metric that a lot of people talk about in cloud is a complement, not as an alternative. As a complement is mean time to recover, which is when you go down, how quickly do you get back up?
Well, that your comment kind of leads into kind of one of the last kind of big categories of discussion for today is, okay, what happens once my product's in market? So there's a whole different perspective of delivering software that's just an app. What is it when it's actually a cloud function associated with a medical device? So relative to change control and just operational organizational operation process, how do things change with cloud in post-market? Guy, you have any thoughts there to start the discussion?
Yeah, so first you have to monitor. If I was talking earlier about writing those tests, so when those tests produce results, especially failures, you have to those results should be viewed in a standard metrics in the same tools you view CPU utilization or any other thing you use for your product, and the DevSecOps team should be able to trigger alerts, internal alerts, so these failures are being treated as soon as possible.
Randy, any thoughts there?
Yeah, it's 3 buckets. I just say at a high level, think of it in 3 buckets. These all sound familiar. You're going to monitor uptime in your systems, right? Ping, are you up? Are you up? Are you getting good responses? Then you're going to look for things that are not failures, but may indicate drift towards failure. So an acceptable performance level is 1 second response time, right? And right now it's a half second, but next week it's another 5% worse and 5% worse. So you're going to want to get on that before you cross the 1 second. And then the third one is this idea of proactively monitoring much more aggressively. And I've learned this is I don't know if it's a third rail. It's a very complicated issue. We're not calling it verification. We're not calling it revalidation. Although my understanding is that is a debate that is going to be coming down the pipeline, or something that may be changing in the industry from the regulators. It's monitoring, but what you are going to start doing is probably borrowing more activities that you did during verification and validation and reapplying them as monitoring steps.
Yeah. And I would say, this is a trend I'm seeing in the industry right now. So, with the FDA's move from computer system validation to assurance, ISPE GAMP 5 version, 2nd edition, they're starting to move away from these point-in-time verification activities. So in the pharma side, you don't call it IQ, OQ, PQ anymore. It's different forms of verification, and they're shifting more towards a continuous compliance stance. This is happening in the industry in general, I would say, this desire to move towards this continuous compliance ability, but cloud enables that a lot easier. So you're getting a lot of tooling. If you made changes to physical infrastructure in your data center, it's humans in the loop. Now with infrastructure as code, it's alerted. When anything changes. So you're working through, as Guy said, it's an API world. To make a change, you go through an API to bounce your servers, change a security group, whatever. You're using an API, so you know immediately when something happens. You can trigger rules and checks, see if anything has changed that drops you now out of a state of compliance. If it has, trigger immediate remediation and get back in compliance. So it's this continuous stance of compliance now, not these point-in-time steps. And to Randy's point, yeah, it was always a case of you went through formal validation, and then you never really drop out of it. Today, from a regulatory perspective, you drop into change management. So how do you deal with those changes? Your regulatory kind of classification of the device doesn't change because things are happening and things are changing in your IT environment. So it's a mind shift. It's a direction I see the industry wanting to go, and cloud is really an enabler with the tooling that you get for monitoring, for detecting and responding to change like this, it really will enable you to reach this continuous compliance stance.
So one question came back actually when I asked what are the biggest challenges, that they actually wanted to push back to the panel saying, what were the topics that seemed to be the biggest challenge or challenges that have been debated the most in the group? So what's the biggest challenge in implementing cloud change control from your guys' perspective or from the discussion of the group? Guy, you wanna
Yeah, so actually I want to also, the challenge is actually related to also what's happening when your monitoring alert triggered. That's not like okay, so let's work on that and fix that. Actually, you don't. The alert is not triggering when the change happened. Actually, the alert is triggering when your test failed, and maybe since you tested it last, maybe it was 10 minutes ago or 30 minutes ago, meaning that it's an indication that there is a time period that the system already worked on patients and produced wrong results, function incorrectly. So it's not like just, okay, let's work and fix that. Maybe you want to go retroactively and invalidate computations done in the past 30 minutes or so. Maybe you want to notify patients and doctor who may be exposed to them. So there is this change of how to fence your risk when you find this change is impacting you.
Randy, any thoughts?
I think they've covered it pretty well. I was once taught, if you don't know how to say, go this. So.
Okay. And Ian, if you do this, I'll ask a different question.
No. I mean, I agree with Guy. It's one of the hottest things that has been debated in the team is around this testing.
Yeah.
And level of testing you should be doing in production, and the level of monitoring and the robustness of that monitoring and how quickly you can respond, balanced against kind of the norm for the industry today and the current regulatory situation, the expectations of the agencies.
I will also add one other challenge. It hasn't been a debate between us, but it's been a challenge, is we've tried to be really good about not inventing new terms or not using the same term in a different way than has been elsewhere. And when we try to be really good about provenance and I can't remember the proper term for, etymology of these terms, it's hard because it turns out a lot of the documents we go back to where we're like, oh yeah, so how do they define validated state? There's nobody who's ever actually defined it, or the terms are different. So it turns out when we're trying to be good and not create more mess, and I don't say this knocking the people who came before us, it's really, really hard to have consistent definitions. And that seems to plague us ongoing as a result. You have colloquial usage, you have the definition in 62304, you have the definition in FAR 21, you name it. It's a challenge.
There's a couple questions that came in, so let me kind of frame up. One actually I think is a great one, is when is it anticipated that TR 115 will be published or issued? Any broad perspective that you can share on that regard, or just watch this space?
Well, I was saying summer of this year, and then I was saying Q4 of this year. Now I'm saying, and I'm cautiously optimistic, Q1 of next year, it will be formally approved and published by AAMI. And for those of you who are interested, at that point, we intend to immediately submit an application for it to become recognized guidance by the FDA. There's no guarantees. We know there's a lot of interest at the FDA in having something like this to be able to recognize.
Okay. One other question that came up is, and this is the balancing between in development and in post-market, are there new or more verification activities introduced when you're in post-market? Are there like different steps and activities and deliverables that are associated with it, or it follows the same pattern associated with across both? I'll take that. I'll take that.
Actually, I would say this is a good example of we have not solved all the issues. These are things that industry is going to have to work through. We haven't tried to take all of this stuff to the nth level of detail, partially because it would have never been done, partially because this stuff's going to move pretty fast. And so what we're hoping, invitation to the community here, is that people will step forward and take approaches to this and then share what they've learned or what they've done. You know, and those things could basically become sort of a body of supporting materials that'll evolve, or it could be things that potentially get rolled into another version of the TIR or a different consensus report. But if we can share our brainware more as we tackle this, it's going to be a lot better, folks.
Right.
Definitely, we are speaking about cloud and defining this term of digital data environment, but actually it's not just the cloud that can go under this umbrella. It could also be an Android operating system and other kinds of operating systems that continuously evolve, continuously change, and we did not include those in the TR because we really needed some focus, or else it would not converge. So this is like future directions to provide more clarification of building, for example, mobile-based medical devices.
Well, we're coming close to the end of time. We wanted to do two things. First, I want to issue just a general question. Our intent of this webinar was to be thought leadership oriented versus practical and potentially product oriented. So hopefully that you found value in a good discussion around a meaningful topic that are along the way. We wanted to ask, and the poll questions drafted to say, what else would you like to talk about? And it can be another strategic topic that is aligned to something relative to your discipline within the medical device stakeholder community, or the range of stages of a device, or it could be some practical discussions on certain tactics or required steps in the architecture or the process. So it's an open-ended question, because what we're trying to do is add value as part of the ecosystem to be able to contribute to the discussion, both at a strategic level. As you can see, the time and effort associated with those working groups is significant, but it's valuable. But also there might be some meaningful discussions on specific topics as well. So I'll leave that open for just a little bit. That'll help us feed doing something similar to this, because I think the one thing that's really great about being in and around medical device, and I've been doing that for my 30+ year career, while you have competition, the reality is you're all trying to make everything better. So there is something here to sort of build a community around topics on how we best leverage cloud and how we best deal with the change associated with it. So I'll just leave it open for a little bit more. Okay. Okay, so we'll come back with that. Any other closing remarks briefly from the panel?
Randy, go
I'll just
work
say
on
it's
the TIR.
I'll just say from my background and my current position, I was really encouraged that this is happening, that we can bring clarity to the industry, that we can change for the better. I mean, I got into this to ultimately help patients. My way of doing that is to try and elevate the industry. So the more I can help, the better.
I think this is an enabling standard. It didn't go to realms where the medical device industry tells clouds how to work, how to change, which would never happen. So it's really for accelerating innovation.
Well, I think we're at the end of our time. I know it's probably the end of either a break in the day or late in the day for our European friends who joined. Thank you very much. If you have any specific questions, we will try to follow up on the questions that were issued in the chat if we know who issued them. But you can also send us information at info@biot-med. That's and we'll facilitate that across our speaker community and follow up as soon as we can. But thank you for the time. We hope this added value, and we'll look forward to a future webinar.